For over 100 years, battles have raged in the air for command of the skies.
If you don't have air supremacy, you're in trouble.
Since its earliest beginnings in World War I, the airplane is the supreme weapon of the armed forces.
This was a real battle for civilization, for humanity.
It revolutionized battle and changed the ways war was fought and won.
The F-117 has obviously changed how we design aircraft and air campaigns.
War drove innovation in the skies.
What we hear from the Air Force is when the F-35 wasn't there, all others died. When F-35 was there, they reigned supreme.
Aircraft bred a new kind of hero. The fate of entire nations depended on the bravery of a handful of men.
An appreciation of the extent to which young men were willing to put their lives on the line for an ideal is something we need to remember more often than we do.
In this episode, Navy airmen faced the fire in the heat of the battle.
That day I realized this is not fun anymore. They're really trying to kill us.
Bismarck is dealt a fatal blow by the Swordfish torpedo bomber.
The crew of Bismarck realized that this was going to be the end.
Ship-launched planes were created almost at the birth of manned flight.
The Admiral, who observed his landing back on the Furious, proclaimed that this was the greatest flight since the Dove flew from the Ark back on the Furious.
The Sopwith Camel pioneered new ways to attack the enemy.
The Tongan raid was the first attack on an enemy position staged from a carrier deck. And it's the harbinger of aircraft carriers.
Even more ingenious ways were developed to strike deep into the heart of enemy territory.
Saran means literally in Japanese, clear sky storm.
When the Navy takes the plane to the seas, the plane takes the fight to the heart of the enemy. In the 1960s, American aircraft carriers like the USS Intrepid patrolled and controlled the seas around Southeast Asia. Loaded with Skyhawk bombers and Sky Raiders, its sphere of influence was over 6,000 square miles.
The Intrepid, when built, was one of the fastest ships in the world. The Essex-class ships, the aircraft carriers, they were the largest aircraft carriers in the world, and they were the fastest ships built at the time. They were able to deliver over 100 aircraft to the battle with a crew of over 3,000 on board.
By 1967, the American aircraft carrier USS Intrepid and its crew were serving in the Vietnam War in the fight against the North Vietnamese.
Intrepid's mission during the Vietnam War as an attack carrier was to fulfill the need of Operation Rolling Thunder. And this was the Americans' program to bring the Vietnamese to bay, to bring them to the negotiating table and to end the war in Vietnam.
On board was the Sky Raider attack plane.
The Douglas Sky Raider was a single-engined naval attack aircraft that was designed very much as a successor to the famous Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber that had been very successful for the American Navy, particularly in the Battle of Midway and throughout the Second World War.
Naval aircrewman Jerry Fiola served on the USS Intrepid during its 1967 mission to Vietnam.
And my role was, as part of aircrew, was to, the squadron's role was to jam enemy radar.
Jerry Fiola was part of a three-man crew flying the Sky Raider.
The aircraft that I flew in, the Sky Raider, was not a fighter at all. We carried ECM gear, carried a center fuel tank for longer missions, and then on the wings where bombs would be, we had electronic countermeasures. That was configured for the mission that day.
But the Sky Raider's electronic countermeasures were not infallible.
It was a technology in progress, but it was really very effective depending on the crew.
The Sky Raider took up a lot of valuable room on the aircraft carrier too.
It's a very, very big aircraft. If you see one in the flesh, it's unbelievably big, and yet as soon as it's in the air, it handles like a much smaller aircraft. It's very maneuverable, very graceful. Because it's large and heavy, but it has this big wing, it's lightly loaded, it can haul an immense amount of gear and still handle well. It was well handling enough that pilots in Vietnam particularly could fly absolutely at ground level and hug the terrain and dodge around trees and hills and so on and so forth. Pilots loved it.
For American Skyhawk pilots, the protection of the Skyraider often meant the difference between getting shot down and returning to the ship safely.
They would launch us first because we were in a propeller-driven aircraft, and we were slower than the jets. They would launch us first. We would head to the beach, we called it, and that was North Vietnam. And it would either be Haiphong Harbor mostly or Hanoi.
As the American jet fighters approached Vietnamese territory, enemy radar tracked their path in preparation for launching surface-to-air missiles.
And that's when we started to do our job.
The Skyraider's job was to jam enemy radar to defeat enemy missiles.
The idea was that they would go up at the time that strike missions were taking place. With their sensors, they could tell where the enemy radars were operating, so they would be able to find the radars and direct strike missions against them.
On one mission to bomb North Vietnamese ground positions, the Skyraiders had a close call.
All of a sudden, we heard in my headset, launch, launch, launch. Just as I shoot a picture, I see a little bit of a vapor trail come off an island. That's the first time I've ever seen, and the only time I ever saw, a surface-to-air missile. It was an SA-2 missile.
The biggest threat to a Skyraider once it was up was anti-aircraft fire and surface-to-air missiles.
It looked like a telephone pole flying by at a rate of speed that I was like unimaginable. I couldn't believe how fast it was. Then I realized quickly in my mind, we could never outrun that thing. It was an eye-opener for me. That day I realized this is not fun anymore. They're really trying to kill us.
November the 17th, 1967, was a fateful day for Jerry Fiola. It was a day he'd never forget.
A large strike was taking place with numerous air wings, which were the units of aircraft on each aircraft carrier, taking place against a boatyard and a transshipment centre near Hanoi.
But Jerry was not assigned to fly the mission. His job was to perform a last-minute safety check on the Skyraiders just before takeoff.
I was on the flight deck. I saw a problem with the left wing. A hydraulic line got pinched, and I canceled the mission. Here I am, just a sailor, had the authority to do that. That was my job. If I saw one drop of hydraulic fluid, that plane didn't fly. And that plane that I downed was going to fly a mission with 2 Skyhawk aircraft. I had 25 seconds to make a decision. Once I saw the problem, I had 25 seconds. And my dilemma was, my commander, Darville, was flying that mission with 3 crew members that I knew.
Jerry Fiola knew that grounding the Skyraider could have fatal consequences for the pilots of the Skyhawk interceptors.
But worse was, I knew when I downed that aircraft that the 2 Skyhawks that were flying after were not going to have protection. And my thought is they could get shot down. I was in a panic for a while because I thought the line was so pinched that I figured it wasn't even going to fall back up. And then they did. Now I'm thinking, oh boy, I hope I made the right decision on this thing.
The Skyhawks were ordered to attack the North Vietnamese without the protection of the Skyraider.
A number of Skyhawks were directed against the radar sites to help the strike mission get through. Among these was Lieutenant Commander Wilson Key.
Jerry needed to follow the progress of Lieutenant Commander Wilson Key's mission.
In the ready room, we could hear on speaker, and one of those aircraft was lost and the pilot was killed. I was sitting in the ready room in my chair after hearing this news, disgusted. I think I may have even been nauseous. And that old timer, the mechanic that said, "Hey, kid, good call," he found me in there. He knew I'd be really upset. And by now, the whole ship knows we just lost an aircraft. And he sat on the seat in front of me, and he looked at me and he grabbed my shirt and pulled me in really close. And he pointed his finger at my nose. He said, "Remember, kid, that was a good call." And I probably said to him, "Yeah, but," and he said, "Yeah, but nothing." May have been some language there. And he said, "This is what war is like." He said, "You could have killed 4 guys in that Skyraider if that particular hydraulic line burst." It made me feel a little bit better, but you live with those things for 50 years.
Today, the Intrepid Sea, Air and Space Museum presents its proud combat heritage to visitors from all over the world. The history of naval aviation has its roots in a pair of flying circus performers who toured America in the early part of the 20th century. In 1910, American Captain Washington Chambers believed that the early aircraft could take off and land from ships. At the same time, engineer Glenn Curtiss and his pilot Eugene Ely were touring the US as the Curtiss Exhibition Team.
The Curtiss Pusher was one of these early iconic airplanes that people remember. It did some special things.
7 years after the first manned flight by the Wright brothers, Glenn Curtiss designed and built his own aircraft.
They actually used to race them around. They used them a lot in the early exhibitions, stunting in air shows and stuff, exposed the general public to the early flying abilities that the airplane had.
Eugene Ely and Glenn Curtiss were approached by US Navy Captain Washington Chambers with a proposition. If he would supply the vessel, would they take part in the US Navy's daring experiment to take off from the deck of a ship?
Most importantly, could they actually achieve a takeoff from a deck of a ship with an aircraft? Would be the first time that it had ever happened if they could achieve that.
It was a tempting offer for these two pioneering aviators.
This was a first. Nobody had done it before. What makes you think you could even achieve that? You've got to put yourself into the position of these pioneer aviators. These were daredevils. These were people willing to explore. They wanted exciting activities. They wanted to be the first.
Eugene Ely and Glenn Curtiss had a date with destiny as they attempt to make the world's first ever takeoff from the deck of a ship. It's 1910, and American barnstorming aviators Eugene Ely and Glenn Curtiss had been approached by the US Navy to attempt the first ever flight from the deck of a ship. The plane for this historic flight was an aircraft designed by Glenn Curtiss, the Model D Curtiss Pusher.
The Curtiss Pusher was just that. It was a small aircraft with the engine mounted behind the pilot, but that compact package of center of gravity had the pilot, fuel, and engine in the center of the airplane, but significantly it had the propeller behind, pushing the aircraft rather than in the front, pulling it forward.
Despite its fragile looks, the plane was surprisingly sturdy.
So this airplane would have been a better airplane for controllability. It's a biplane, so it was very strong. It had a good landing gear system. And, and a pilot out front there, looking for everything he needed to do and see.
Eugene Ely and Glenn Curtiss were still pioneers operating at the dawn of aviation.
For somebody that today flies a modern ultralight or something, this airplane wouldn't be that difficult to fly. But you got to realize back then, they had to teach themselves how to fly. It wasn't like they came out of a school somewhere with all this flying time and they jumped in one of these. This is what they trained in. And I don't know if you've noticed back there, there's only one seat. There was no instructor sitting next to you when you learned how to fly. I think they obviously picked a great pilot to do the stunt, if you will. And of course, he would have been flying a great airplane.
The Curtiss Pusher was an unconventional aircraft, even for its time.
This airplane actually has a slightly different set of controls than what most modern pilots are used to. So what he did was, where normally the rudder is controlled by the pilot's feet in a modern airplane, he actually hooked it up to the steering wheel. So when you turn the wheel to the right, you see the rudder in the bag goes to the right. Since Glenn Curtiss was a motorcycle racer, And he was used to leaning into the turns when he raced his motorcycle. He thought I'd do the same thing with the airplane. So he came up with this little U-shaped bracket here that he would actually sit inside with his arms, and he would lean into the turn. And as you can see, the cables are connected to the ailerons out on the wing there. And as that one goes up, you can see this other one on the other side here goes down. Okay, so when this one goes up, the other one goes down. If I was going to make a turn to the left, I would lean to the left while turning the wheel to the left, and when the nose started to drop, I would slowly pull the control back, okay? And then to go back the other way, I would lean this way, and at some point when the nose dropped, I would pull it back, and that would actually pull the nose around just like a normal airplane.
Eugene Ely arrived with his airplane in Norfolk, Virginia, on the east coast of America, on November the 13th, 1910. The following morning, he watched as sailors gently lifted and placed it onto the USS Birmingham. The scene was set. It would either be a spectacular splash and crash, or a flight into the history books. Headlines from the New York Times announced the brave attempt.
Ely's first flight from the temporary deck fitted to the front of the USS Birmingham was purely an experiment. It was part of this experiment working with the US Navy to see if even it could be achieved.
The plan was to steam into the Chesapeake Bay on America's east coast and launch the plane.
He set out, the aircraft galloped along the deck of the ship, left the ship, dropped immediately as it left the bow of the ship, dropped 40, 50 feet, just touched its wheels into the water. The propeller even struck the water and damaged the propeller, and just regained flight.
He landed on land after a very short flight. He barely got onto the beach. He landed because he knew he wasn't going to be able to make any airfield.
Eugene Ely was disappointed that he had to make an emergency landing.
But when he looked around, all he could see was people shouting and cheering and waving, and he began to realize that actually making it to the air yard, the naval yard, wasn't necessarily the significance. What he'd done was left the ship in an airplane and landed back on land. And from that point, yes, everybody recognized that this was a successful first.
After the successful takeoff, Ely and Curtis were set a more daunting challenge.
Taking off from a ship and making that critical first flight to land is one thing. Landing back onto a ship was what was really necessary. That was going to be essential to being able to prove that you could successfully take aircraft to sea.
The attempt was scheduled to take place in San Francisco on the west coast of America in January 1911. Ely faced the greater danger of landing aboard a ship.
He also explores the very early potential for using arrestor gear to help slow him down. So a hook was positioned on the rear of the Curtiss pusher and lightweight cords put across the deck so that when he touched down on the deck, hopefully one of the cords would connect with the hook and pull him to a halt.
But the landing would have been the critical thing. And of course, he had to be spot on the touchdown, on his airspeed, to be able to slow down. This thing actually has a brake, but it's a pretty primitive one. So the difference wasn't anything about the flying of the stuff. He basically had to learn how to do a spot landing, and it would be very unforgiving if he missed.
With longer wings and hooks on the landing gear, and Ely donning a padded football helmet and bicycle inner tubes around his body in case anything went awry, all was ready on the morning of January the 18th, 1911. Crowds lined the shore, and boats collected in the harbour to witness the daring flight. At 11 a.m., Ely took off from nearby Tanforum racetrack and headed for the Pennsylvania. To the delight of thousands of spectators, Ely made a safe landing, the arresting equipment working perfectly. After lunch with the ship's captain and a few photographs, the platform was cleared and the USS Pennsylvania was pointed into the wind. Ely took off and flew into the history books. Captain Chambers was moved to make a public announcement.
The Admiral observed his landing, proclaimed that this was the greatest flight since the Dove flew from the Ark, which I guess from a naval perspective and naval aviation, he really wasn't kidding.
But Eugene Ely's luck was to run out soon after the historic flight. Disaster struck in the small US town of Macon, Georgia.
In 1911 in Macon, Eugene Ely was doing an exhibition flight, and he himself, when asked, what are you going to do after this? There probably won't be any after this. He said, I'll probably be killed like most of the rest of us who fly these early planes, and he was.
An untimely death was commonplace with early aviators. But Eugene Ely's name lives on as a pioneer who gave birth to naval aviation.
This was the start point of a whole new technology that both America and Great Britain would explore as the carrier development unfolded.
In the years that followed Ely's pioneering flight, launching planes from the deck of ships would continue to be extremely hazardous. Despite the inherent danger, the British Sopwith Camel was adapted for a bombing mission to take out German Zeppelin bases in Denmark. In 1917, World War I ushered in the next tentative steps into naval aviation. The British Royal Navy experimented with a prototype aircraft carrier as a new tactical weapon, the seaplane lighter.
The seaplane lighter was another attempt for the Royal Navy to take aircraft to sea.
The plane that was chosen for the historic flight was the legendary British Sopwith Camel. It scored more kills than any other Allied aircraft in World War I.
Camel has twin forward-firing machine guns, and it got its name. It's not an official name. It's the F-1 Camel, but it got its name because you'll notice there's a metal fairing over the base of the machine guns, or the butts of the machine guns. It's named the Camel because of that hump there. The Camel is, in a sense, a natural because of its high maneuverability and its ability to climb very quickly.
If towed fast enough into a headwind, the Sopwith Camel could launch from the seaplane lighter.
The craft is only 58 feet long, but towed at speed with a blast of throttle from the Camel, they could just get a Sopwith Camel airborne.
It's the ideal plane. It's small so that you can carry a number of planes on that short deck, and then it can take off very quickly.
Now, a British fighter plane could be taken to sea and within reach of enemy targets.
One of the main uses of the seaplane lighter was Zeppelin hunting. That was a shock for the Germans that almost grounded the Zeppelin flights overnight.
The seaplane lighter proved itself as an effective addition to the British naval fleet.
So the seaplane lighter is a really important start point and stepping stone in the history of what would become the history of the aircraft carrier.
During World War I, German Zeppelin airships were deployed against British targets.
The Zeppelin threat to Great Britain was very significant in World War I. To have aircraft, albeit that they're Zeppelins, not necessarily fixed-wing aircraft, coming over Great Britain and actually dropping bombs.
A plan was made to destroy Germany's Zeppelin bases at Tondern in Denmark. This would be the first ever bombing raid to be launched from an aircraft carrier.
The Tondern raid represents a milestone in the sense that the Royal Naval Air Service, from the very beginning of the war, had taken an offensive stance to the war. In other words, they wanted to strike at German raiders that would be coming over England.
But Denmark was beyond the range of the British World War I aircraft.
The question was, how did you get at the sheds? And finally, what the Royal Naval Air Service develops is the notion that you need to fly land aircraft off of some kind of a carrier deck.
To do this, Britain's Royal Navy decided to use a Courageous-class battlecruiser that had just been converted into an aircraft carrier, HMS Furious. To carry out its mission, the Sopwith Camel was navalised. The 2F.1 Camel had a top speed of 113 miles per hour and a maximum range of 300 miles, and it could carry a payload of 2 50-pound bombs. To make room for the planes, the battlecruisers replaced their front gun turret with a small hangar that had a 160-foot flight deck on top.
Furious, it had a converted deck space at the front of the ship, which enabled 7 Sopwith Camels to be taken to sea at one time, with just enough room for the camels to take off.
Furious was something of a halfway state to the modern aircraft carrier, and was something of an experimental ship.
Hot boiler gases poured from her centerline funnel, causing air turbulence that blew the planes off course. Almost every landing ended in an accident.
Flying off a carrier deck has always been a risky business. He's looking at maybe 30 or 50 feet of deck, and he's got to get off in that, and he's got to rise. You can always sink a little bit below the decks and come up. But if you get too far down, you're not going to come up. You're going to crash in the ocean. And the ship is going to simply go right over you and crush you. And the difficulty is as well, when you come back, you're not going to land on the carrier. You have to land in the North Sea. And if they don't get you out of the North Sea within 5 minutes, you can die from hypothermia.
Despite the hazards, Britain's HMS Furious set off on July the 17th, 1918, escorted by a fleet of battleships and cruisers. The plan was to sail up to 12 miles off the German coast. From there, the Camels would take off in 2 waves.
The Royal Navy felt that they could carry out a surprise attack by taking off very early in the morning, 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning.
From HMS Furious, the squadron of British Sopwith Camels flew 80 miles across the North Sea to the Zeppelin airbase.
The first wave of 3 Camels arrives at Tondon and catches the Germans completely by surprise. They weren't expecting anything like this, any kind of attack at all, let alone one from a ship just based offshore up the coast.
The British Sopwith Camels began their bombing run.
There are reports of Germans running out of the barracks, half-dressed, attempting to fire rifles at these aircraft that are buzzing overhead, and stories of the pilots waving at them as they go past.
Of the aircraft that took place, 5 scored direct hits out of the 7. 2 Zeppelins were destroyed, and 1 large observation balloon, plus destruction of the Zeppelin sheds and hangars.
This attack was a game-changer in naval warfare.
The Tondon raid really proved that carrier-based aircraft could successfully attack targets that were out of range of other targets.
Between World War I and World War II, naval technology rapidly developed. Transporting planes aboard ships took a novel turn at the end of World War II in 1945, with a unique Japanese plane that was carried by a submarine.
The whole idea of using a submarine was to approach the target stealthily, if you will, underwater, unseen, undiscovered until they were close into the target. Then the submarine would surface, perhaps very early in the morning, and launch the airplane. It would go off and drop its bomb or torpedo on the target and then come back. The idea was to surface again at a rendezvous point and recover the airplane and, of course, the pilot.
The Japanese submarine was specially built to carry the attack bomber.
The HE-M6A was a remarkable aircraft, really.
The idea was to carry 3 of these Saran airplanes that we see behind us on this submarine, so it had a very large cylindrical tank designed and built on top of the hull of the submarine, and 3 of these Sarans could be fitted into this tank.
Because it was developed specifically for this purpose, it had a lot of technical innovations.
The bombers were stored by folding the tail and wings and dismantling the float.
It had a similar performance to American or British carrier-based attack aircraft that were in service at the time.
The unique Japanese bomber was dubbed Siren.
The nickname of the Saran means literally in Japanese, clear sky storm. The sub would approach the target in a stealthy mode, if you will, underneath the waves, underneath the water, unseen, undiscovered, and unheard.
And with the ability to pop up, make an attack, and disappear, and it was a very, very threatening concept to other navies that had nothing like this.
Produced by the famous Aichi manufacturer, the Siren M6A1 was loaded with powerful munitions.
The Saran carried about a 500-pound bomb or a 1,500-pound long lance Type 95 torpedo, which was the best and most advanced torpedo in World War II.
The Siren was armed with its own rear gunner for defense.
If the airplane came under attack, then the gunner could, of course, help to defend the airplane because he had his own machine gun pointing aft from the fuselage.
The Siren and its submarine were part of a bigger Japanese combat plan.
The Saran was part of a plan by Admiral Yamamoto, who was the senior officer in charge of the Imperial Japanese Navy, to take the war to the United States. The size of the I-400 submarine allowed it to have the range to sail from Japan to the coast of the United States and bomb these targets. But the war ended before any of them were able to carry out any attacks.
But the Siren and its submarine represented extraordinary feats of engineering.
I think the most interesting thing about it is that it was designed to be disassembled and folded up and stored on a submarine that could dive under the water and actually had great range and, had the potential in its design to attack coast targets.
Nobody was building a submarine as big as these I-400 Japanese aircraft carrier submarines until the 1960s. So it took nearly 20 years for the rest of the world to catch up with this technology.
A pioneer in design, the Siren was also far ahead of its time.
It looks like a streamlined and well-designed airplane that was never meant to be taken apart and folded up and stored on a submarine. Normally, when a designer makes those sacrifices, the airplane ends up looking less streamlined and sort of gawky and awkward, but this is a rather graceful airplane.
In the unforgiving North Sea, a fleet of World War I planes joined forces with World War II carriers in a desperate bid to sink Germany's largest warship, the Bismarck. It's 1941, and in the early years of World War II, Britain was alone and under siege as Germany attacked the small island. Naval aviation would play an important role in defending the country from the seas. A new German battleship threatened Britain's survival, the Bismarck.
She was a massive battleship with 15-inch guns, modern, fast, and hit the water just before the war and was ready for action in May 1941.
The 50,000-ton steel battleship bristled with 8 15-inch cannons and an armory of anti-aircraft guns. It was Germany's largest warship.
The Bismarck was, at the time it was built, the most powerful battleship in the world.
Pitted against the Bismarck was a humble biplane, the Fairy Swordfish. The British Swordfish was a 1930s torpedo bomber that served as a frontline attack aircraft for the Fleet Air Arm of the Royal Navy. Hardly faster than the old World War I Spats, the Swordfish was already obsolete by the time it entered service in 1936.
The nickname for the Swordfish was the string bag, and this was because it was said that, like a shopping bag made out of string for carrying your oranges and your packages of tea home and everything else, the string bag aircraft, the Swordfish, could carry just about anything. You could carry mines, torpedoes, rockets, whatever. They all loved the string bag.
As part of Britain's battle fleet, this fragile biplane's mission was to sink the Bismarck. The formidable German warship was protected by 4-inch thick armour around its hull. It quickly gained a reputation of being invincible and a threat to Britain's survival.
It was a threat to Britain because the Bismarck could threaten Britain's command of the North Sea and also the North Atlantic sea lanes.
The Bismarck was ordered to destroy the vital convoys that Britain depended upon for its survival.
If they could cut off those convoys, Britain would starve, Britain would surrender, Germany would win the war.
The reputation of Britain's Royal Navy was also at stake.
The Bismarck was symbolic as well, the Bismarck being this great battleship. The Royal Navy ruled the seas, and if the Royal Navy couldn't deal with one German battleship, then maybe the Royal Navy didn't rule the seas after all.
And that made it even more imperative to hunt down and destroy the Bismarck, both now for political and morale reasons as much as for the very valid military reasons that were important for keeping such a powerful ship out of the Atlantic.
The Bismarck came south through the Denmark Straits between Iceland and Greenland. It was heading toward the North Atlantic to roam like a wolf, hunting down Britain's vital convoys.
If Bismarck got out there, she would be very difficult to find in the vastness of the Atlantic, like a needle in a haystack.
Churchill cashiered admirals right and left because, in his view, they didn't quite have the killer instinct. And this was a case where he wanted that ship destroyed and he wanted it sunk and he wanted it done now.
Under orders from Prime Minister Winston Churchill, a British flotilla of warships searched thousands of square miles seeking out the Bismarck. In the battle group was the aircraft carrier HMS Arc Royal, loaded with Fairey Swordfish torpedo planes.
A Royal Air Force Catalina flying boat spotted Bismarck, and so that was confirmation that she'd gone south and was heading for a French port.
HMS Arc Royal's Swordfish bombers prepared to attack. But conditions for an aerial attack were far from perfect.
The weather conditions were pretty bad in general, and probably no other aircraft except the Swordfish could have taken off to mount an attack or even to try and find Bismarck.
But they had to take care not to take too long flying in cloud because although that hid them from the enemy, ice would start forming on the wings almost as soon as they went into the cloud. So it was very dangerous, difficult conditions.
Armed with only one small torpedo each, the plan was for the British Swordfish torpedo bombers to damage the Bismarck and slow her down. But their chances of success diminished as weather conditions worsened.
The deck landing control officer who would direct the aircraft into land actually had to be tied into position, otherwise there was a chance he might have been blown over the side.
So 20 men were assigned per Swordfish to push the aircraft down the flight deck to arrange them ready for launch.
The Bismarck was rolling and pitching 60 feet in the air. Launching the Swordfish seemed a suicidal mission.
The idea of actually flying aircraft from these aircraft carriers at the time was absolutely mad, and yet there was no other choice but to try and launch these aircraft, and there was really no other aircraft that could have even thought of flying in those conditions than the Swordfish.
Despite the appalling conditions, the Navy pilots and crew of Britain's HMS Arc Royal were determined to carry on with their mission.
Those 15 aircraft were launched and then formed up over HMS Renown, the Force H flagship, and were all together in flights of 3.
May the 26th, 1941, 8:47 p.m. Battling the gale, the Swordfish bombers dropped from the clouds. Armed with only one torpedo each, ranged against Germany's most powerful battleship, they closed in on the Bismarck.
most incredible thing happens, which is that actually the biplanes are flying sideways, because in a gale, the actual momentum of the Swordfish, half the speed was spent in trying to get forward.
The plan was for the Swordfish aircraft to attack the German battleship in quick succession from different angles, dropping torpedoes, so the Bismarck would have to zigzag to try to avoid them.
So what the Swordfish would like to do is to come in very quickly from different directions and give Bismarck no chance at all of evading their torpedoes.
Germany's Bismarck fired all of its 40 anti-aircraft guns at the valiant Swordfish torpedo bombers. But amazingly, the prevailing weather conditions also worked against the Bismarck's big guns.
When the Germans were firing at these things that were floating about, going sideways and up and down, and couldn't shoot any of them down, I think they were pretty much in a state of despair, and it would have increased their fears and also their feeling that the Royal Navy was going to get them.
Incredibly, the Bismarck failed to bring down a single British Swordfish torpedo plane. Despite the Bismarck's anti-aircraft guns and the appalling weather conditions, the Swordfish dropped their torpedoes.
Several times, the torpedo just bounced off. The first aerial attack on the Bismarck, they radioed back to Berlin, had been hit by a torpedo. All it did was scratch some paint.
But one torpedo hit the Bismarck's stern as the warship was turning, jamming the rudder.
There was no way that Bismarck could escape after the rudder was jammed, because she was entirely at the mercy of the wind and the waves.
Bismarck was a wounded beast.
The Bismarck was in serious trouble, really unable to manoeuvre.
The flotilla of British warships closed in like a pack of wolves and assaulted the Bismarck, sinking Germany's largest battleship within a matter of hours.
So Britain has to thank those young men for having persevered with this ancient aircraft against this modern battleship, and found that they had the strength and the stamina and the bravery to go in and cripple Bismarck.
Naval aviation has changed the face of modern warfare.
It couldn't be clearer that the aircraft carrier was going to be what was required in 20th century warfare from that point on, anywhere around the world.
In the years following the Curtiss Pusher's pioneering flight, naval aviation has influenced sea battles in ways its pioneers, Eugene Ely, Curtiss Pusher, and Captain Washington Chambers, could never have imagined.